My name is Harper, and last Saturday I watched my sister's perfect wedding crumble in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the length of one piano piece I'd been waiting 6 months to perform. When my fingers hit those final notes, the groom didn't just stop smiling. He turned ghostly pale, whispered something to my sister that made her face crumble, and walked straight out of the church without a single word to the 200 guests who sat in stunned silence. Before I tell you how one song exposed a secret that destroyed what was supposed to be the happiest day of my sister's life, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and hit that like button if you've ever had something precious taken from you by family who claimed it was for the greater good. Trust me, you'll want to see how this musical revenge played out. Growing up in our suburban Atlanta home, music wasn't just my passion. It was my lifeline. While my older sister Melody got the attention for her perfect grades and social butterfly personality, I found my voice through the keys of our grandmother's 1952 Steinway baby grand piano that sat like a beautiful centerpiece in our living room. That piano had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down from my great-grandmother who'd been a jazz pianist in the 1940s. Grandma Rose always said it would be mine someday, and from the moment I could reach the pedals, I treated it like the treasure it was. The pattern started early in our household. When I was 8 and Melody was 11, I won the regional youth piano competition with a piece I'd spent months perfecting. That same week, Melody made varsity cheerleading as a freshman. Guess which achievement got the celebration dinner? My parents, David and Catherine, threw a party for Melody's cheerleading success, while my trophy gathered dust on the piano's music stand. Music is a nice hobby, Harper, my mother said when I asked why we weren't celebrating my win. But Melody's achievement opens doors to scholarships and opportunities. Even at 8, I understood the subtext. Melody's success mattered because it had practical value. My music was just noise they tolerated. By high school, the favoritism had crystallized into an art form. When Melody needed a dress for homecoming court, my parents spent $400 without blinking. When I needed sheet music for the state competition that could qualify me for Juilliard's summer program, they handed me $20 and suggested I find free versions online. The irony wasn't lost on me that my sister, whose name was Melody, couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, while I, Harper, was the one making actual music that moved people to tears. The piano became my sanctuary during those years. Every afternoon after school, I'd sit at that bench and pour my frustrations, my dreams, and my pain into those keys. The instrument seemed to understand me in ways my family never could. When I played Chopin's nocturnes, the melancholy matched my loneliness. When I tackled Rachmaninoff's concertos, the passion matched my determination to prove myself. And when I composed my own pieces, something I'd started doing at 15, the piano helped me find my voice in a household where I felt invisible. My parents' attitude toward my musical talent remained consistently dismissive throughout high school. When I was accepted to 3 different music conservatories with partial scholarships, they barely glanced at the acceptance letters. When Melody got into State University with no scholarship at all, they threw another celebration dinner. The message was clear. Traditional college success trumped artistic achievement every time. Even when my piano teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, called my parents to tell them I had exceptional, possibly professional-level talent, they thanked her politely and changed the subject to Melody's upcoming sorority rush. The piano wasn't just an instrument to me. It was my connection to family history and my path to a future where my talents would be valued. I spent countless hours researching the Steinway's history, learning that my great-grandmother had bought it during the jazz age when she was performing in Atlanta's underground music scene. She'd sacrificed for months to afford it, working double shifts as a seamstress while pursuing her musical dreams at night. The piano represented generations of women in my family who had chosen art over convention, creativity over conformity. When I played it, I felt connected to something larger than my parents' narrow definitions of success. During my senior year of high school, something magical happened. A local music producer heard me play at a coffee shop's open mic night and offered me a chance to record a demo. He said my compositions had a unique voice that blended classical training with contemporary sensibility. For the first time, I saw a concrete path where my music could become more than just a hobby. I could write soundtracks, compose for films, maybe even record albums. The demo session went incredibly well, and he promised to shop it around to contacts in Nashville and Los Angeles. When I told my parents about this opportunity, their reaction was predictably lukewarm. "That's nice, honey," my mother said, not looking up from her phone. "But make sure you have a backup plan. Music is such an uncertain career." Meanwhile, when Melody announced she was changing her major for the 3rd time, from business to communications to finally settling on elementary education, They praised her for finding her true calling and following her heart. The double standard was so glaring it would have been comical if it weren't so painful. College years brought some respite from the family dynamics, but the pattern persisted during every holiday and family gathering. I was attending Georgia State on an academic scholarship, double majoring in music composition and business because I'd learned to hedge my bets against my parents' skepticism. Every winter break and summer vacation, I'd return home to find the piano exactly as I'd left it, waiting for me like an old friend. Those homecoming sessions were bittersweet. The joy of playing was always tempered by the reminder of what I was fighting against. Melody, meanwhile, had found her groove in college social life and was dating Brad Winters, a business major whose family owned a successful chain of sporting goods stores across Georgia. From the moment she brought him home sophomore year, my parents treated Brad like the son they'd never had. He was everything they valued. Conventionally handsome, financially stable family background, traditional masculine interests like golf and football. When Melody called to announce their engagement during my junior year, the family celebration reached new heights of enthusiasm. The wedding planning consumed our family for the next 18 months. Every conversation, every family dinner, every holiday gathering revolved around Melody's perfect day. The guest list expanded from intimate family affair to social event of the season, with 200 invitations going out to extended family, college friends, Brad's business connections, and my parents' social circle. The budget ballooned accordingly, with my parents taking out a home equity loan to cover the escalating costs of their dream wedding for their golden child. As the wedding expenses mounted, I noticed subtle changes in my parents' behavior. They'd always been frugal with me while being generous with Melody, but now they seemed actively stressed about money in ways I'd never witnessed before. Phone calls with banks, hushed conversations about interest rates, and my father working longer hours all pointed to financial strain I hadn't anticipated. The wedding had become not just a celebration, but a financial burden that was affecting the entire family dynamic. 6 months before the wedding, the catastrophe struck with cruel efficiency. I was home for spring break practicing for my senior recital, when my parents called me into the living room for a family meeting. The serious tone immediately put me on edge, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. They sat across from me on the couch, their expressions grave, while I remained standing near the piano, like I was protecting it from an unseen threat. "Harper, we need to talk about finances," my father began, his voice carrying the weight of uncomfortable decisions. "The wedding costs have exceeded our budget significantly, and we've exhausted our savings and the home equity loan." I waited for the explanation of how they'd cut back on wedding expenses, perhaps choosing a smaller venue or reducing the guest list. Instead, my mother delivered the blow that would fracture our family relationship permanently. "We've decided to sell the piano," she said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "It's worth approximately $45,000 according to the appraiser, which would cover the remaining wedding expenses and give us a small cushion for unexpected costs." The casual way she discussed selling my great-grandmother's piano, my connection to family history, my creative sanctuary, as if it were just another piece of furniture, left me speechless. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline or the revelation that this was some kind of test. When neither came, the reality hit me like a physical blow. "You're selling my piano to pay for Melody's wedding?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The piano that's been in our family for 3 generations? The piano Grandma Rose promised would be mine?" My father's response revealed the depth of their financial desperation and their priorities. "Harper, you're being dramatic. It's a beautiful instrument, but it's also an asset we can liquidate to solve our current problem. Melody's wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and we want it to be perfect for her. You can always play piano at church or on digital keyboards." The suggestion that I could replace my Steinway grand with an electronic substitute showed how fundamentally they misunderstood both music and what that piano meant to me. The argument that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. I pleaded, I reasoned, I offered alternatives. Could they postpone the wedding to save more money? Could they scale back the reception? Could I take out loans against my future earnings to help with costs? Every suggestion was met with dismissal and irritation that I was making their difficult decision even harder. "The piano represents the past, Harper," my mother said with finality. "Melody's future represents hope and new beginnings. We have to prioritize what matters most to this family." The message was crystal clear. I was the past, something to be sold off when convenient. Melody was the future, worth any sacrifice. That night, I called every relative I could think of, hoping someone would intervene or offer to buy the piano to keep it in the family. My uncle seemed sympathetic, but was going through his own financial difficulties. My grandparents on my father's side offered kind words but no concrete help. Grandma Rose, the one person who might have stopped this travesty, had passed away 2 years earlier, taking with her the promise that the piano would someday be mine. The sale happened with ruthless efficiency. Within 2 weeks, professional movers arrived to crate up the Steinway and transport it to its new owner, a wealthy collector who would probably display it in a showroom, rather than play it daily like I had. I couldn't bear to watch the removal process, so I spent that day at my college apartment, crying into my pillow while my roommate offered tissues and comforting words that couldn't touch the depth of my loss. When I returned home the following weekend, the living room looked grotesquely empty. The space where the piano had lived for my entire life was now filled with a generic entertainment center my parents had bought to make the room more functional. The irony of replacing a priceless musical instrument with a TV stand wasn't lost on me, but I'd learned that pointing out such ironies only led to lectures about being ungrateful and dramatic. Melody's reaction to the piano sale was perhaps the most painful part of the entire experience. When I confronted her about whether she knew what they'd done to fund her wedding, she shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who'd never been denied anything she wanted. I mean, it's sad, I guess, but you're graduating soon and moving out anyway. It's not like you'd be here to play it much longer. Her complete lack of empathy or understanding of what had been sacrificed for her perfect day crystallized everything wrong with our family dynamic. The wedding preparations continued with even greater intensity after the piano sale provided the necessary funds. Melody's dress was custom designed by a boutique in Atlanta. The reception venue was upgraded to accommodate wine pairings with dinner, and the honeymoon was extended from 1 week in the Caribbean to 2 weeks touring Europe. Every enhancement was funded by the sale of my great-grandmother's piano, but my parents spoke about these upgrades as if the money had materialized from nowhere. During the final months before the wedding, I threw myself into my senior composition project with an intensity that bordered on obsession. My professor had assigned us to create a 15-minute piece that demonstrated everything we'd learned about musical storytelling. Without access to my piano at home, I practiced on the school's instruments, staying late into the night to work on something that would serve as my senior recital centerpiece. The composition I created was unlike anything I'd written before. It started with a gentle, nostalgic melody that represented innocence and family harmony. Gradually, discordant notes crept in, representing tension and favoritism. The middle section became increasingly chaotic, with competing melodies fighting for dominance, symbolizing the breakdown of family relationships. But the final movement was where I poured all my pain and anger. It was a haunting, minor-key melody that told the story of sacrifice and loss, of dreams deferred and promises broken. My composition professor was so impressed with the piece that he encouraged me to enter it in the state collegiate composition competition. When I won first place, earning a $5,000 prize and the opportunity to have the piece performed by the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's Young Artists program, I felt a vindication that had been missing from my life for years. Finally, someone in a position of authority was recognizing that my musical talents had real value and potential. The news of my competition win reached my family through a brief mention in the university's newsletter that my aunt forwarded to my mother. Their reaction was characteristic. Polite congratulations followed immediately by excitement about the latest wedding planning development. "That's wonderful, honey," my mother said during our weekly check-in call. Speaking of wonderful news, Melody's photographer just showed us the preview shots from her engagement session, and they're absolutely stunning. As graduation approached, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. I was going to attend Melody's wedding, but not as the quietly supportive little sister they expected. I was going to perform my award-winning composition, the one that told the story of our family's dysfunction through music. When Melody had casually asked if I wanted to play something nice during the ceremony, she'd unknowingly given me the perfect opportunity for musical justice. The irony was perfect. My composition, created in response to losing my piano to fund her wedding, would be performed at that very wedding using the church's piano. The piece that had won state recognition for its emotional depth and artistic merit would finally be heard by the family members who had dismissed my musical talents for years. But there was something else about this composition, something I hadn't told anyone. Hidden within the complex musical structure was a melody that would be instantly recognizable to anyone who had spent time in certain circles of Atlanta's music scene. During my research for the composition, I'd interviewed older jazz musicians who had known my great-grandmother and the scene she'd been part of in the 1940s. One elderly pianist had shared stories about the underground venues where black and white musicians had played together despite segregation laws, and how certain songs had become coded messages within that community. He'd taught me one of those songs, a piece called Secret Love, that had special meaning for musicians who had lived double lives, hiding parts of themselves from society's judgment. I'd woven that melody into my composition as a tribute to my great-grandmother, But during the months of perfecting the piece, I'd discovered something unexpected. Brad Winters, Melody's perfect fiancé, had a secret that would make that hidden melody particularly meaningful. It was a secret I'd stumbled upon accidentally, but one that would make my wedding performance infinitely more powerful than just a sister's musical revenge. 3 months before the wedding, I'd been at a coffee shop near campus when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. Brad was sitting 2 tables away, speaking quietly but intensely, with another man I didn't recognize. The man was older, maybe in his 40s, with an artistic air that seemed completely at odds with Brad's conservative appearance. What caught my attention wasn't their conversation about art galleries and exhibition spaces, but the way Brad kept reaching across to touch the man's hand, the intimate way they looked at each other, the obvious romantic tension that had nothing to do with wedding planning. I'd sat frozen behind my laptop, pretending to work while watching Brad Winters, my sister's devoted fiancé, conduct what was clearly a romantic relationship with another man. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, and by the end, I'd heard enough to understand that this wasn't a casual friendship or a business relationship. Brad was living a double life, maintaining his engagement to my sister while conducting a serious relationship with Marcus, an art curator who was apparently unaware that Brad was weeks away from marrying a woman. The discovery left me in an impossible position. My relationship with Melody was already strained because of the piano sale and years of family favoritism. If I told her what I'd witnessed, she'd likely assume I was lying out of jealousy or spite. Even worse, my parents would probably blame me for trying to ruin Melody's happiness with unsubstantiated accusations. But if I said nothing, I'd be allowing my sister to marry a man who was fundamentally deceiving her about his identity and capacity for commitment. Over the following weeks, I found myself inadvertently gathering more evidence of Brad's double life. I saw him with Marcus at an art gallery opening, holding hands in the dimly lit space between exhibitions. I overheard phone conversations when he thought he was alone, speaking in the tender tones of someone deeply in love, but not with his fiancée. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, but it also provided an opportunity I hadn't anticipated. During one of my composition practice sessions, I'd been playing around with different arrangements of the Secret Love melody when the connection hit me like lightning. This song, this coded message about hidden truth and concealed identity, could serve as more than just a tribute to my great-grandmother. If I performed it at the wedding, and if Brad recognized the melody and understood its traditional meaning in certain musical circles, he might finally confront the truth about his own secret love. The plan that formed in my mind was elegant in its poetic justice. The composition I'd created in response to my family's betrayal would serve multiple purposes at Melody's wedding. It would showcase the musical talents they'd dismissed and sacrificed. It would tell the story of family dysfunction through musical metaphor. And hidden within its complex structure, it would carry a message that might force Brad to confront the lie his entire engagement represented. I spent the final weeks before the wedding perfecting my performance, practicing on the church piano during quiet afternoon hours when the building was empty. The piece was technically challenging, requiring precise timing and emotional control to convey its layered meanings effectively. But more than technical proficiency, I needed to deliver it with the kind of conviction that would make its message unmistakable to anyone who needed to hear it. The night before the wedding, as I lay in my childhood bedroom listening to the sounds of a house preparing for celebration, I felt a strange peace settling over me. Tomorrow, I would either achieve the most perfect musical revenge in family history, or I would create a scandal that would destroy relationships permanently. Either way, the truth would finally be heard, and the music that had been silenced by the piano sale would speak with a voice too powerful to ignore. The morning of Melody's wedding dawned perfect and clear, as if the universe was setting the stage for the drama about to unfold. I woke early, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. Today, my family would finally hear what I had to say, and I would say it in the language I spoke best: music. The composition that had cost me my piano would be performed at the event that piano sale had funded, creating a symmetry that felt like destiny. As I dressed in the conservative navy dress my mother had approved for appropriate wedding guest attire, I thought about my great-grandmother and the courage it must have taken to pursue music in an era when women's artistic ambitions were even less supported than they were today. She'd played in secret clubs and underground venues, using coded songs to communicate truths that couldn't be spoken aloud in polite society. Today, I would honor her legacy by using music to reveal truth in my own family's polite society. The church was already bustling with activity when I arrived for the morning rehearsal. Melody looked radiant in her elaborate gown, surrounded by bridesmaids and wedding planners, ensuring every detail was perfect. Brad stood at the altar in his custom tuxedo, playing the role of devoted groom with the same skill he'd apparently been using to hide his true nature throughout their relationship. Watching him practice his vows about eternal love and commitment, knowing what I knew about his double life, made my stomach turn. When the wedding coordinator asked about my musical contribution, I handed her the sheet music and explained that I'd be performing an original composition during the ceremony's interlude, between the vows and the ring exchange. It's a piece about family, love, and the importance of truth in relationships, I told her, which was accurate even if it wasn't complete. She glanced at the complex notation and nodded approvingly, clearly assuming that any family member talented enough to write such sophisticated music would deliver an appropriately sentimental performance. My parents spent the morning in a state of proud excitement, greeting guests and accepting congratulations on their daughter's perfect wedding. The financial stress that had driven them to sell my piano seemed forgotten in the joy of seeing their investment pay off in social recognition. Several guests commented on the beautiful ceremony venue, the elegant reception space, and the obvious love between the bride and groom. If only they knew the whole truth about what had funded this perfection and what lay beneath its beautiful surface. As guests began arriving for the afternoon ceremony, I took my position at the church's piano, a beautiful Yamaha Grand that was smaller than my lost Steinway, but would serve my purposes perfectly. I ran through some warm-up exercises, letting my fingers reacquaint themselves with the instrument, while my mind prepared for what was about to happen. In less than 2 hours, I would either achieve the most satisfying musical revenge in family history, or create a scandal that would haunt family gatherings for generations. The ceremony began with traditional pomp and elegance. Melody floated down the aisle like a fairy tale princess, her custom gown trailing behind her in expensive perfection. Brad waited at the altar with the kind of smile that looked genuine to everyone who didn't know what I knew about his secret life. My parents beamed with pride from the front row, clearly feeling that all their sacrifices and financial stress had been worthwhile to create this moment of social triumph. The early parts of the ceremony proceeded exactly as rehearsed. The minister delivered thoughtful remarks about marriage, commitment, and the importance of honesty in building a life together. The irony of his words, given what I was about to reveal, wasn't lost on me. When Melody and Brad exchanged their carefully written vows about eternal love and unwavering devotion, I had to grip the piano bench to keep from reacting visibly to the hypocrisy unfolding before me. Then came my moment. The wedding coordinator nodded in my direction, and I stood to address the congregation before beginning my performance. "I'd like to perform an original composition I wrote this year," I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the church's excellent acoustics. "It's about family, sacrifice, and the power of truth to transform our relationships." This piece won the state collegiate composition competition, and I'm honored to share it with all of you today. I saw my parents exchange surprised glances, clearly not expecting me to mention my award or frame my performance in terms of truth and transformation. But it was too late for them to intervene, and I was already seated at the piano, my hands positioned over the keys for the opening measures of my musical revenge. The composition began gently, with the nostalgic melody representing childhood innocence and family harmony. I played those opening phrases with the kind of tenderness that made several guests smile and nod approvingly. This was exactly the kind of sweet, sentimental music they'd expected from the bride's little sister. But as the piece progressed, subtle dissonances began creeping in, representing the tensions and favoritism that had poisoned our family dynamic. About 2 minutes into the performance, I began weaving in the first hints of the secret love melody, disguised within the complex harmonic structure, but recognizable to anyone who knew what to listen for. I watched Brad's face carefully as those notes emerged, and I saw the exact moment when recognition dawned. His confident smile faltered, his posture stiffened, and he shot a quick, panicked glance toward the congregation as if trying to determine who else might be hearing what he was hearing. The middle section of my composition grew increasingly intense, with competing melodies fighting for dominance like family members arguing over resources and attention. The piano's bass notes rumbled with the kind of deep structural tension that made some guests shift uncomfortably in their pews, sensing that this music was telling a story more complex than typical wedding fare. But it was the final movement where I unleashed everything I'd been holding back for months. The climactic section began with a dramatic chord progression that silenced the church's ambient noise and commanded absolute attention. Then I launched into the most emotionally raw part of my composition, the section that told the story of sacrifice and betrayal, of promises broken and dreams sold for someone else's happiness. My fingers flew across the keys with precision and passion, channeling months of pain and anger into musical expression that was far more powerful than any words could have been. But it was in the final minute of the piece where I delivered the killing blow. I played the secret love melody in its full, unmistakable form, no longer hidden within complex harmonies, but stated clearly and boldly for anyone who knew its meaning to recognize. The melody that had once served as a coded message for people living double lives, hiding their true selves from a judgmental society, now served as my coded message to Brad about the impossible position his deception had created. As the final notes faded into the church's silence, I looked directly at Brad and saw a man whose careful facade had completely crumbled. His face was pale, his hands were shaking, and he was staring at me with the expression of someone who'd just realized their secret was no longer secret. The recognition in his eyes confirmed what I'd suspected. He knew exactly what song I'd just played, and he understood exactly what message I was sending. For several long seconds, the church remained silent, with guests uncertain how to respond to a musical performance that had clearly been more complex and intense than anyone had expected. Then Brad did something that confirmed my suspicions more dramatically than any private conversation could have. He leaned over to whisper something urgent in Melody's ear, something that made her face transform from radiant bride to confused and concerned woman in the space of a heartbeat. What happened next unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. Brad straightened up, looked out over the congregation of 200 guests, and spoke the words that would end my sister's perfect wedding before it was officially completed. "I'm sorry, I can't do this." His voice carried clearly through the church's acoustics, reaching every guest who had gathered to celebrate his commitment to my sister. The silence that followed was deafening. Melody stared at her groom with an expression of complete bewilderment, clearly not understanding what was happening or why. My parents half rose from their seats in the front row, their faces cycling through confusion, alarm, and growing horror as they realized something was going catastrophically wrong with their perfect day. Brad turned to face Melody directly, and though his voice was quiet, the church's acoustics carried his words to every corner of the building. "I'm not the man you think I am, and you deserve better than someone who can't give you the love you deserve." Without another word of explanation, without addressing the guests or acknowledging the chaos he was creating, Brad walked down the center aisle and out of the church, leaving his bride standing alone at the altar in her $10,000 custom gown. The explosion of gasps, murmurs, and shocked exclamations from the congregation created a sound unlike anything that church had ever heard during a ceremony. Melody stood frozen for several long moments, still holding her bouquet, still wearing the radiant smile that had been appropriate just minutes earlier, but now looked tragically out of place. When the reality of abandonment finally hit her, she let out a sound that was part sob, part wail, and all heartbreak. My mother rushed from her seat to gather Melody in her arms while my father stood helplessly nearby, his face red with embarrassment and fury. The wedding coordinator began trying to manage the crisis, quietly suggesting that guests move to the reception hall while the family dealt with the immediate emergency. But most of the 200 guests remained rooted in their pews, too shocked to move, too curious about what would happen next to politely excuse themselves. As chaos swirled around me, I remained seated at the piano, my hands still resting on the keys that had just delivered the most effective revenge in family history. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a strange sense of completion. The truth had been told, the secret had been revealed, and the lie that was Brad and Melody's relationship had been exposed before it could trap my sister in a marriage built on deception. It was Melody herself who finally broke through the crowd of concerned relatives and wedding staff to confront me directly. Her face was streaked with tears, her perfect makeup ruined, her dream day transformed into a nightmare, but her voice was surprisingly steady when she asked the question I'd been dreading. "What did you do, Harper? What was that song, and why did it make Brad run?" The truth couldn't be hidden any longer, and frankly, I was tired of carrying the weight of Brad's secret alone. In front of our extended family, our family friends, and 200 wedding guests who were pretending not to listen while hanging on every word, I told my sister about the coffee shop conversation I'd overheard, about seeing Brad with Marcus at the art gallery, about the phone calls and the obvious romantic relationship he'd been maintaining throughout their engagement. "The song I played," I explained as gently as I could manage, "is called Secret Love, and it has historical significance in certain musical communities as a message about people living double lives, hiding their true selves and their real relationships." When I played it just now, Brad recognized it and understood that I knew about Marcus. Rather than live with that truth being known, he chose to end the charade. The revelation hit our family like a second bomb. My parents, who had sacrificed so much for this perfect wedding, had to confront the reality that the groom they'd embraced as a son had been lying to everyone, including their daughter, throughout the entire relationship. The financial strain, the piano sale, the stress and celebration of the past 18 months had all been in service of a fundamentally dishonest union, but it was my mother's reaction that surprised me most. Instead of anger at me for revealing the truth, instead of blame for ruining the wedding, she looked at me with something approaching respect for the first time in years. "You knew," she said quietly, "and you tried to protect her." In that moment, I realized that my musical revelation hadn't just exposed Brad's deception. It had demonstrated a kind of courage and family loyalty that my parents had never recognized in me before. The aftermath of the wedding disaster unfolded over several hours as guests gradually departed. The reception was canceled, and my family tried to process what had happened. Melody, once she got past the initial shock and humiliation, admitted that she'd sensed something was wrong with Brad in recent months, but had attributed his distance and distraction to normal pre-wedding nerves. "I thought he was just scared of commitment," she confessed through her tears, "not that he was committed to someone else entirely." The financial implications of the canceled wedding were staggering, but they seemed secondary to the emotional reckoning our family was experiencing. The piano had been sold to fund a wedding that was now revealed to have been based on a lie from the beginning. The sacrifice that had seemed so meaningful and necessary just hours earlier now felt grotesquely wasteful. As evening fell and the last of the crisis management was completed, I found myself alone with my parents for the first time since the disaster had unfolded. I expected anger, blame, accusations that I had sabotaged my sister's happiness out of jealousy and spite. Instead, my father did something unprecedented in our family history. He apologized. "Harper," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and regret, "we should have listened to you more over the years. We should have valued your talents and supported your dreams instead of dismissing them as impractical, and we never should have sold your piano." My mother nodded in agreement, tears streaming down her face as she added, "What you did today took incredible courage. You saved Melody from a marriage that would have destroyed her, even though you knew we might blame you for ruining her wedding." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had as a family. For the first time in my life, my parents acknowledged the pattern of favoritism that had shaped our household, admitted that their financial priorities had been unfair, and recognized that my musical talents represented something valuable rather than just an expensive hobby. They couldn't undo the piano sale, but they could finally see what it had cost, not just financially, but emotionally. 3 months after the wedding disaster, several developments had fundamentally changed our family dynamic. Melody had started therapy to process not just the trauma of being abandoned at the altar, but the deeper questions about why she'd been willing to ignore her intuition about Brad's behavior. My parents had begun couples counseling to address the financial stress and communication issues that the wedding planning had revealed in their own relationship. As for me, the composition that had served as my musical revenge became the foundation for something I never could have anticipated. A music producer who had been a wedding guest was so impressed by the piece's emotional power and technical sophistication that he offered me a contract to compose soundtracks for independent films. The piece that had told the story of family dysfunction and hidden truth launched my career as a professional composer. The most unexpected development came 6 months later when my parents presented me with a check representing the insurance payout they'd received on the piano after discovering it had been damaged in transport to its new owner. "We can't give you back your great-grandmother's Steinway," my mother said, "but we can help you buy a piano that will be yours to keep forever." The gesture couldn't erase years of favoritism and dismissal, but it represented a genuine attempt to make amends for past mistakes. Melody eventually thanked me for saving her from a marriage that would have been built on deception, though it took several months for her to reach that point of perspective. "I was so angry at first," she admitted during one of our newly honest conversations, "but then I realized you were the only person who cared enough about my real happiness to risk telling me a truth I didn't want to hear." The wedding that was supposed to showcase our family's success instead became the catalyst for our family's first honest reckoning with its dysfunction. The piano that was sold to fund perfection ended up financing a performance that revealed imperfection. And the sister who had been dismissed as the family disappointment became the one who demonstrated true loyalty and courage when it mattered most. Looking back, I realized that losing my piano was devastating, but not destructive. It forced me to find my voice in new ways, to create music that was more powerful than anything I might have played on that beautiful Steinway. Sometimes what feels like the greatest loss becomes the foundation for the greatest growth. My advice to anyone who's ever had something precious sacrificed for someone else's dreams: your value doesn't depend on what others choose to preserve or discard. Create something new from what they took away, and let your talents speak louder than their doubts ever could. If you've ever used your skills to protect someone you love, even when they couldn't see they needed protection, share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about family drama, hidden truths, and the power of music to change everything in just 4 minutes and 37 seconds.